Welcome to the Deseret Audio Library. On this side of this cassette, you'll hear Brad Wilcox and a talk entitled HOGMET, What to Do When They Say It's Not True. And now, Brad Wilcox.
Brothers and sisters, in the church, we have a wonderful meeting every month called the Fast and Testimony Meeting. I love that meeting because we get to hear one another bear testimony. One member after another will stand at the pulpit and share a testimony that sounds something like this. I know the church is true. I love that meeting because we hear those words over and over. We hear them from a variety of people, and we hear those words, and as we hear those words, we feel the Spirit confirm to our spirits that we're hearing something that is right, and something that is good, and something that is true. But you know as well as I do that there are other times in our lives when the people who surround us are not saying, I know the church is true. And there are many times when we are confronted on all sides by people who would try to do anything to convince us that we are wrong and that our faith is misled. Tonight, I want to share a few thoughts with you about what to do when others say it is not true. I remember teaching the 15-year-olds in Sunday school. There was a young girl in my class who was always talking and laughing with her friends. She was never being quiet, and finally one Sunday she showed up and she was rather quiet. She was very subdued. She asked me if she could ask a question. I said, sure. What is it that you want to know? I was surprised by her unusual seriousness, because she was always joking and laughing with her friends, even during my lessons. And so I couldn't understand what would be so serious that she would now be this solemn. She said, I have this friend, and the other night we were talking, and he says he doesn't believe in Joseph Smith anymore because Joseph Smith was a gold digger and a thief, and he drank a lot. I smiled. She continued, my friend has these books that prove it. And that was the life and death matter. This 15-year-old girl had finally had her first taste of the cold and nutritionless dish called anti-Mormon literature. How many of you have ever been confronted with anti-Mormon literature? I find more and more that young people throughout the entire church are having to face this. One young man came up to me and he said, it's so frustrating when they come up and they tell me what I believe. They don't ask me what I believe. They come up and tell me what I believe. And then when they say something completely bizarre and I say, no, I don't believe that, they say, oh, well, you have to say that. I know you have to say that. It's like one of the rules, you know. You have to say you don't believe it, but inside you do. They see one movie about the Mormon church and they feel like they're experts. They don't ask. They tell them what they believe. Let me share a few letters with you that have come from young people just in the last few months. This young man writes about an incident in another church in which they had a guest speaker, and he called the Mormons cultists. He says, I was very upset, and so I told the youth pastor of that other church that he was wrong. The youth pastor apologized that the speaker had offended me, but told me that he believed what the speaker had said, that Mormonism was a cult and that Mormonism was satanic. He also told me that the Book of Mormon was false. He says, I know he's wrong, but it really made me look bad in front of my friends because they won't listen to my testimony. I love our church so much, but I don't know what to say when they say it's not true. Here's a letter that came from a young lady who said, there's a large, quote, Christian group in my school who continually tell me that I am following Satan and that I am going to hell for my beliefs. Another young lady says, why do other churches spend so much time and money putting out movies, books, and videos that talk bad about our church? She says, we don't do that about their churches. Very interesting letters coming from young people who are very concerned about what to do when they say it's not true. And that's what happened to this young lady. She said, these books, they say the church isn't true. They say it's a cult and that Joseph Smith was a con man who was just trying to make up stories because he wanted power and money. Now that's when I stopped the young lady and I said, wait. I said, hold it. Not everything you're reading in those books is true. She said, but it's in a book. I had to explain that just because something is printed, just because something is published, just because something is sold, distributed, even popular, doesn't make it true. She then said, well then how do you know when something you hear or read about the church is true? It's a good question, especially when we consider how much misinformation is available today. Moroni once told young Joseph Smith, they will circulate falsehoods to destroy your reputation, and also will seek to take your life. Persecution will rage more and more, for the iniquities of men shall be revealed, and those who are not built upon the rock will seek to overthrow this church, but it will increase the more it is opposed, and spread farther and farther. The angel's words to the prophet have been and are still being fulfilled. Since 1830, when the church was organized, there have been over 2,000 anti-Mormon books, novels, movies, pamphlets, tracts, flyers produced in English, with the most dramatic increase in such publications since the 1960s. Brother William O. Nelson wrote, few other religious groups in the United States have been subjected to such sustained criticism and hostility. So how do we know when something we read or something we look up on the internet or something that we have distributed to us at our homes, how do we know when something like this is true? This young Sunday school student and I decided that the things we heard, the things we read, would have to pass a test. We called it the HOGMET test. We decided that everything we heard was going to have to pass this test. Each letter stands for a question that we can ask ourselves. When we hear something or read something that doesn't quite sit right, HOGMET, H stands for hearsay. Is it hearsay? Oh, I heard that Steve asked Amy out. Now, I wasn't there myself, but my friend's brother's Relief Society President's Home teacher's best friend was right there when it happened. And we all know that sometimes people are not necessarily talking about things they know themselves, but rather they're passing along things that they happen to hear somebody say. Hearsay. It's interesting to note that many of the self-appointed critics who claimed and even signed affidavits that Joseph Smith and his family were, quote, destitute of moral character and addicted to vicious habits and particularly famous for visionary projects. Many of the people who actually signed legal documents claiming that that was the case had never even met the prophet. They'd never even seen him. They never even lived in an area where they could have ever had contact with him. They simply were passing on something that they had heard someone say. So the first question we ask ourselves, is it hearsay? The second question, is it out of context? Even scriptures can be misinterpreted if they're taken out of context. I mean, imagine yourself in your brand new Jeep. You're sitting there at the crosswalk. Your worst enemy is walking in front of you. And suddenly you remember what the Spirit told Nephi. Wherefore slay him, for the Lord thy God has delivered him into thy hand. And if we take scriptures out of context, they can be completely misinterpreted. I remember reading once about how Brigham Young was a false prophet because he made a statement that the Mormons in the Salt Lake Valley would one day sit as kings and queens upon thrones. This particular anti-Mormon publication said, I don't see any kings in Utah. I don't see any queens in Utah. I don't see any thrones in Utah. So obviously Brigham Young was a false prophet. They had taken his statement, which was made in the context of the temple, completely out of that context. And out of that context, It may have seemed strange, but within the context in which the statement was originally given, it was not strange at all. It was true. Is it out of context? How many of you have ever heard that Joseph Smith was a gold digger or that Joseph Smith was a treasure seeker? How many have ever heard that? Yeah, and sometimes that can be a little alarming, especially for young people who hear it for the very first time. They don't realize that Joseph Smith lived in a frontier America. And out of that context, they don't understand what's being said. How many of you have seen the Disney movie Pocahontas? If you've seen that movie, then you realize that the movie makes quite clear that one of the main motivations for the settlers coming here to this continent, one of the main motivations was gold. In fact, that same motivation was a major factor behind the westward movement in the United States, and it is a major factor in what drew people to a no-man's land called Alaska. It was not strange in Joseph Smith's day for some to seek treasure or to seek gold, and Joseph was employed at one point by a man who had such desires. But to call Joseph a treasure seeker or a gold digger out of this context does not fairly represent his occupation, his motivation, or his character. So we ask ourselves, is it hearsay? Is it out of context? H-O-G. Is it a generalization? Is it a generalization that doesn't have sufficient evidence to support it? We hear generalizations all the time. In fact, how many of you have heard something like this? Mormons are prejudiced. How many have heard that one? What about this one? All Mormons have large families. All Mormons are perfectionists. How many have heard that one? Yeah. All Mormon women are on medication for depression. Hopefully we can see some of these statements as being true perhaps of one or two, or true perhaps even of many, but not true of all. We need to recognize them for the hasty and unsupported generalizations that they are. To believe that every member of Joseph Smith's family was ignorant, lazy, and worthless, and that all the males were blasphemers, liars, and thieves, as some authors have written, is as ridiculous as believing that all North Americans are millionaires and all Mormons sing like the Tabernacle Choir. We have to be able to recognize an unsupported generalization. I remember listening to a national news broadcast one time when they were interviewing a woman who had written a book about the Mormon Church. She was a former Mormon. She had written a book talking about all the things that happened in the Mormon Church. As she talked to this man who was asking her questions, she made the statement that, like her ex-husband, all Mormon men were authoritarian, dictatorial, domineering, and even abusive. Now, recognizing that such a hasty generalization was a little far-fetched, one caller called into the program and said, "I'm not Mormon, but I live next door to a Mormon couple and the husband's wonderful. Why are you blaming your former church just because you married a jerk?" I was grateful that the caller had recognized what I had recognized. Perhaps there might be some men who mistakenly abuse priesthood authority. Perhaps there might be some men who may be authoritarian or dictatorial and even abusive. But to say that all Mormon men are this way is stating a generalization that simply cannot be supported with proper evidence. H, is it hearsay? O, is it out of context? G, is it a generalization? M, is it mudslinging? Mudslinging is a term that goes clear back to ancient Roman times, when politicians who were running for office would have a purple stripe on their white toga. Well, their opponents found that they could make other politicians look bad really quickly and easily by simply having some slaves sit in the dirt streets, and as the politician walked by, they would throw dirt or mud from the streets up onto the politician's white toga. And that's where the term came from. But it didn't stop in ancient Rome. It's something we still see today. We see it between politicians trying to look better than each other. We see it between businesses trying to look better than each other. We even see it in high school rivalries. How many of you have ever gone to a high school game and heard the crowd cheer, "We're number one. We're number one"? How many have ever heard that? Do you realize every high school in this country cheers, "We're number one. We're number one"? I have never ever gone to a high school athletic event and heard the crowd cheer, "We're number 39. We're number 39. No, every high school in the country believes that high school is number one. And sometimes in an effort to look number one, they will often say some rude or mean-hearted comments about their rivals. Well, the question we need to ask ourselves is, were the ministers and scholars who so meanly attacked Joseph Smith innocent of any bias or prejudice? Or were they feeling just a little bit jealous, just a little bit threatened by the dynamic young prophet and the truth that he bore? Richard Lloyd Anderson wrote, "It is unfortunate that the writers who did the earliest work of gathering information about the Smith family were more concerned with blackening their reputation than with finding the facts. Apostates and enemies of the church have always stood to lose something if they could not find or put a little dirt on LDS white shirts." Sometimes we have to stop and ask ourselves, are the things that are being said about our church simply mudslinging? Are some of the other churches feeling just a little bit jealous because we have a church that is the fastest growing church in the world? Are they feeling just a little bit uptight because the members of our church are actually committed, holding callings, leading large groups of people without receiving any pay? Are they feeling a little frustrated because Latter-day Saints pay a full and honest tithe while their members in their churches do not show such dedication? A good question to ask ourselves when we hear things about church leaders, about church history that don't quite settle right. We need to ask ourselves, is it mudslinging? The next letter is E. Is it an exaggeration? I once heard that Brigham Young had over 400 wives. I was taken aback by that. I think Brigham Young would be taken aback by that statement. Now, is it true that Brigham Young had more than one wife at one time? Yes. Did he have 400? No. As tales get passed along, sometimes they get taller. And it's up to us to recognize the stretch marks. I have a hero in church history named Dan Jones, a convert who came from Great Britain and then later returned to Wales as a wonderful missionary for the church. He talks about when he first encountered the church and how so many things that he was hearing were negative. But, he says, and this is a direct quote, "Through a careful investigation of the accusations, I perceived clearly that it was impossible for them to be true, either because in their zeal these people had overstated the case, or because the things they said contradicted themselves in some way." I hope all of us will be as wise as Dan Jones, that we will be able to recognize that sometimes the things that are said about the church are overstated. One anti-Mormon publication made the outlandish claim that Mormons own a substantial portion of Hawaii. Was the author referring to individual members of the church? Was he referring to the church itself? Either way, the facts were obviously being distorted. Another publication said that Utah, with its Mormon population, ranks among the highest of the states in teenage pregnancy and communicable diseases. How many have heard something like that before? Yeah, I've heard it often, but let's think it through. Utah, with its Mormon population, is the entire population of the state of Utah Mormon? Perhaps it's being a little overstated in this case. Ranks among the highest of the states in teenage pregnancy. Well, could a high teenage pregnancy rate be partially due to the fact that with the help offered by priesthood leaders and through church social services, many young couples choose to reveal and continue a pregnancy rather than terminate it through abortion, as some teens do when no such intervention is offered? But communicable diseases, venereal disease, among the highest. I went and looked up the statistics that have been published by the Atlanta Communicable Disease Center. And Utah actually ranks 47th among the states in venereal diseases. 47th. Oh yeah, it's among the highest. It's in the top 50. Sometimes we have to remember that the things that are being said about us may be overstated. Finally, brothers and sisters, we ask ourselves, is it true? Is it hearsay? Is it out of context? Is it a generalization? Is it mudslinging? Is it an exaggeration? And finally, is it true? An unwanted flyer was once placed on my windshield wiper after a state conference. And when I went out to my car, the flyer said something like, before you believe Joseph Smith, read what the Bible says about false prophets. Okay, I thought to myself, but if you are so quick to claim that Joseph Smith was a false prophet, where's the real one? Doesn't the Bible also speak of an absolute necessity of Latter-day Prophets? Doesn't the Bible speak of a restoration? Didn't Jesus say that false prophets could be recognized by their fruits? Joseph Smith and all of his successors have produced nothing but good, worthy, wholesome, and delicious fruits. The flyer went on. Joseph Smith proves himself a liar because he said he saw God face to face. I thought, yes, Joseph did claim to see God. But how does that make him a liar? Moses claimed to see God. Stephen claimed to see God. I don't see anyone running around calling them liar, liar, pants on fire. No. So why does it make Joseph a liar to make a similar claim? To claim to have seen God would be lying unless someone really had seen him, as Moses, as Stephen, as Joseph had. In the exact same way, to claim to be God's son would be blasphemous unless one really were God's son, as Christ was. Truth is truth, and trying to explain it away or claiming that it is impossible cannot change it. Despite those who refuse to believe, Joseph Smith's first vision cannot be disproved. Joseph wrote, I had beheld a vision. I have thought since that I felt much like Paul. There were but few who believed him. Some said he was dishonest. Others said he was mad, and he was ridiculed and reviled. But all this did not destroy the reality of his vision. So it was with me. I had actually seen a vision. I knew it, and I knew that God knew it, and I could not deny it. Truth is truth. And so the final question we ask ourselves when we hear something about the church is it true? Let's read a little anti-Mormon literature tonight. And let's put it to the test. The HOGMET test. Mormonism, Christian or cult? ? Mormons say that men can become like God. All right, brothers and sisters, put it to the test. Is it hearsay? Is it out of context, generalization, mudslinging, and exaggeration? No, what is it? It's true. Now, perhaps we would be a little more tactful, a little more careful about how we might state that. But in reality, brothers and sisters, that is true. Mormons say there's a mother in heaven. Is it hearsay? Is it out of context? Is it a generalization? Is it mudslinging and exaggeration? No, what is it? It's true. Mormons say Jesus and Satan are brothers. What is it, brothers and sisters? It's true. They are spirit brothers. Mormons claim the Bible is incomplete. Again, we might not state it quite like that, but the bottom line is that's true. Mormons say that they have the only true church. Put it to the test. What is it? It's true. That's exactly what we claim. This is my favorite one. Missionaries will knock at your door. I am not making this up. Look, it's right there. Missionaries will knock at your door. They will constantly repeat a testimony of the truthfulness of the church and ask you to read the Book of Mormon for yourself and pray about it to receive your own testimony. You guys, I started reading through this and I thought, anti-Mormon literature, good grief, this should be the family home evening manual. That's the final question we ask ourselves. Is it true? And brothers and sisters, if it is true, then we do not apologize. Elder W. Grant Bangerter once wrote, "Now let me make our position clear. Although we should treat others with kindness, tolerance, and respect, we must stand firmly for the things that have been revealed to us. We do not apologize that we do not have the same doctrines and principles that other churches have. We can talk about it in a warm and friendly way, but we do not apologize. We didn't initiate this restoration. God did. If other churches do not appreciate the church or its doctrines, we nevertheless know that they are true." Now, I realize, brothers and sisters, that some around the world are horribly offended when we claim divine priesthood authority. And I am fully aware that it is far from popular or politically correct to affirm that God has not changed His views on Sabbath day observance, that He has not changed His views on profanity, modesty, or chastity. While the world embraces alternative lifestyles, changing paradigms, and multiple realities, we certainly do not sound very sophisticated when we claim to belong to the only true and living church. Nevertheless, we stand on our testimonies. Testimonies of experience, testimonies of study, and testimonies of personal revelation. We stand on our testimonies and we remain true to the faith that our parents have cherished, true to the truth for which martyrs have perished. We really must not be too concerned when others choose to spend so much of their time and money fighting against our cause rather than simply promoting their own. In a way, their efforts serve only as additional evidence of the truthfulness of the church. It is said that when Benjamin Franklin was the ambassador to France, shortly after the Revolutionary War had concluded, he was very frustrated at times at some of the things that were being said around Europe, some of the things that were being said about his fellow patriots, about this brand new United States. And when he would get frustrated, a friend would remind him, "When I see boys in a field throwing rocks at a tree, I know there's fruit on it, or they would just leave it alone." President Spencer W. Kimball told the youth, "Do not be puzzled if sometimes there are those in the world who mock how you live and what you believe, saying that it is all false, but who deep inside themselves are really afraid that what you believe is really true." The church has always had its critics. It probably always will. President Joseph F. Smith said, "I do not believe there ever was a people who were guided by revelation or acknowledged of the Lord as His people who were not hated and persecuted by the wicked and the corrupt." The church has always had its critics. But we must remember that Jesus Christ also had his critics. In quiet moments of personal contemplation, I often wonder how I would have responded in Jesus' day. I often wonder if I would have been among those who humbly followed him and recognized him, or whether I would have been among the apathetic masses who were so busy going about earning their livings and making it through life that they didn't even care. Or I have even wondered if I might have been among those who actually persecuted and ultimately crucified Christ. Having had such thoughts, I found great comfort once as I read a statement by Elder Bruce R. McConkie in which he tells us that we can know where we would have stood 2,000 years ago because we know where we stand today. Elder McConkie says that those who accept Joseph Smith and recognize him as a prophet are showing the same faith that it would have taken to recognize and believe Jesus Christ. Those who accept modern prophets today are showing the same faith that it would have taken to follow and to be a disciple in Jesus' day. Those who are apathetic today about our message would probably have been apathetic in Jesus' day. And those who fight against our message today, those who fight against living prophets and apostles, would probably have been the very ones who, in the name of religion, would have crucified Christ. Brothers and sisters, when other people say things that upset us, or when we read things that don't quite sit right, we need to remember that we're not defenseless. We've got a test we can put those things to. We've got the HOGMET test. We can keep the things that other people are saying in perspective by asking ourselves, is it hearsay? Is it out of context? Is it a generalization that is unsupported and hasty? Is it mudslinging? Is it an exaggeration? And finally we can ask ourselves, is it true? And if it is true, we stand on our testimonies of truth and we do not apologize. We follow the counsel that we have been given in Scriptures. For in the Scriptures we have been admonished to turn the other cheek. We have also been told to pray for them who despitefully use us. We follow the admonition that we receive in the Book of Mormon as we read about those who were persecuted. Nevertheless, they were steadfast and immovable in keeping the commandments of God, and they bore with patience the persecutions that were heaped upon them. Elder Marvin J. Ashton once spoke in General Conference in April of 1978, and he said, "We have no time for contention. We only have time to be about our Father's business." Brothers and sisters, I know that there are those in the world who would try to convince you that you are a minority in a white church, or that you are a woman in a man's church, or that you are an intelligent person in a church that has no room for intellectuals. I know there are many in the world who would come to you and try to convince you that you have been brainwashed, that you have been manipulated, that you have been somehow fooled or tricked or conned. But for as many people as there are in the world who would fight against us, who would say that Mormons devalue women, or picket Temple Square and denounce church leaders and claim that the spirit we have felt is of the devil, for as many as there are who would claim such things, there are millions of others who stand for what is right. There are millions who stand with living apostles and living prophets and testify of truth. We know the God we worship. We know His characteristics. We know His relationship to us. And we know what He expects of us. We are not confused. Elder Von J. Featherstone once said, "The enemies of the church could line up four abreast from San Francisco to Salt Lake City and try to convince me that the church was not true. And when the last one had passed, I would still know that it is true." As our young people are confronted with anti-Mormon feelings and anti-Mormon publications, as we are all confronted with anti-Mormon literature, I hope that we can remember some of the things we've talked about tonight and keep in perspective the things that are said and written, the movies that are made about the church. I hope that we can help others also keep them in perspective. And ultimately, brothers and sisters, I hope that despite all opposition, we can stand as witnesses of the truth. Brothers and sisters, I leave you with my testimony that the church is true, that the prophets and seers and revelators who lead us are what they proclaim themselves to be. I leave you my testimony that the Book of Mormon is true, that it does stand with the Bible as a witness of Jesus Christ. I leave you with my testimony that we are not wrong. One day every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is the Christ, and that we, the Mormons, were right all along. When Christ comes again, there will be millions of Jews who will be so shocked to see the prints of nails in His hands. And in just the same way, I bear you my testimony that there will be also millions and millions of those who claim to be Christians who will be just as shocked to see the prints of nails in His wrists. God bless you for your strength. God bless you for your goodness. God bless you for having the courage to stand for what is right, to stand for what is good, and to stand for what is true, regardless of what others may think, regardless of what others may do, and regardless of what others may say. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.